Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Aditya Abhyankar and I welcome all the viewers to this particular session. At the outset, I trust that all the viewers who are watching this video, you are safe with your family members, with your loved ones. We are going through very difficult time of COVID-19 pandemic, and probably this is a kind of a pandemic that none of us we have experienced before. And let's take utmost care. Let's make sure that we keep ourselves healthy and away from COVID-19 coronavirus. And I'm very sure that towards the end of this battle, we will emerge out bigger and better. I would also like to take this opportunity and thank Walchand College of Engineering for putting this platform together. In this particular session, we'll be discussing about the pedagogical advancements and different methodologies that can be used for embellishing few interesting concepts in DSP, that is Digital Signal Processing. So let's get started. I have titled my talk as Towards Understanding Transforms a Perspective. And it's all about forming that perspective, isn't it? DSP is a very conceptual subject. It's a very thematic subject. And that's why, in my opinion, it's very important that students and faculty members, they should form their own perspective, their own style of looking at various interesting concepts from digital signal processing. And that's why we need to have interesting pedagogical embellishments that we should adopt in our teaching, so that we'll be able to imbibe that spirit in our students. And in today's session, I would like to bring out a couple of such techniques that I typically use in classroom teaching, and I hope my faculty colleagues will find it interesting and they can think of implementing it themselves in the classroom. We know that DSP is a very mathematical subject, and we end up working with many equations, we end up solving many problems. But in my opinion, three types of chemical locha should happen in the mind of an engineer when he or she looks at any mathematical equation. First, it's important to understand the hardcore maths behind, no doubt about it. The basics of calculus, for example, integration and derivatives. It's very important to have a very sound mathematical understanding of these equations. But along with the mathematical understanding, it's also important to be able to connect these mathematical equations with the physical world around us. And I call this as bringing out the physical meaning out of these mathematical equations. And third, we being engineers, we should be able to implement these equations using microprocessors and microcontrollers. If there are integrations running from minus infinity to plus infinity, how to convert them into closed form and be able to implement those systems, it's equally important. So all the three aspects, in my opinion, are equally important. First, understanding the hardcore maths beneath. Second, connecting that maths with the physical world around us, bringing out the physical meaning out of those equations. And third, being able to implement it using microprocessors, controllers, or computers in order to be able to build the systems that we want and that we desire. And for this particular first session, the topic that I have selected is transforms. And we all know that transforms is at the heart and the crux of DSP. And in fact, it's a journey. It's a beautiful journey, in my opinion. And I call it as journey from romanticism to realism. all the conventional transforms that we have been making use of, with the likes of Fourier transform and Laplace transform and Z transform, they are very romantic. If you look at the equations, if you look at their properties and characterization and the stories of the scientists, it is so romantic. However, for many practical purposes, these transforms, they do not suffice, and they may not be able to give us the correct directives towards finding appropriate solutions. And that's where, from romanticism, we need to slowly and gradually make our transition and move towards more realistic transforms. Transforms which are part of the realms of joint time frequency analysis, and one of such transforms is wavelets. So how we move from all the conventional transforms and slowly and gradually approach towards wavelets. I call this journey as journey from romanticism to realism, and that is what I intend to bring out in this particular session. I also strongly believe that it's very important to make sure that our students, they get connected with this subject, and that's why it's important to share few historical pieces, stories of the great scientists, few demonstrations, because of which the subject becomes more interesting, and that's what I intend to bring out in this particular session. Well, let's begin with the million-dollar question. Why transform? Most of the signals, it could be 1D, 2D, or multiple dimensional signals that we deal with, that we want to process, they are spatial or time domain signals. And then we typically convert them into some other domain, for example, frequency domain or Fourier domain. And it's a very heavy mathematical jugglery. So the first and the foremost question is, why at all do we need to transform these signals from the natural domain, the time domain, into a very complex domain, let's say frequency domain or Fourier domain? And well, the answer of this question is, in my opinion, sheer convenience. We are more comfortable processing the information. We, as in the human beings, we are more comfortable processing the information in frequency domain compared to time domain. Our perception, our understanding, our comprehension of these signals is much better in frequency domain compared to time domain, and that's why, just for our own convenience, we transform these signals from time domain into frequency domain. To convince students, I always give them example of music. So let's see that example. So how do we really understand music? Do we understand music in time domain? And what is music for us? For human beings, how do we comprehend and understand music? Let's try and understand that. I have my harmonium with me, and if I play a tune, let me play a tune. this is tune in Rag Pattadeep, and it's a very devotional rag. So the mood that gets created in our mind is very spiritual. As against that, if you play some other rag which is little more serious, then it may end up creating a very serious kind of emotions in our mind. For example, let's play Bhairavi. So this Bhairavi is more serious rag, and it creates a more serious, more deep, more introspective kind of thoughts in our minds. This is true for Western classical system also. For example, many of our songs in films, they are based on the chord system that they use in Western classical music. For example, a very popular song, Dost Dost Na Raha, Pyar Pyar Na Raha. It's a very classic example of how Western chords are being used in our cinema music, filmy music. So this is a very popular song, and it's more serious, so it creates a very deep, very melancholic kind of mood in our mind. So how do we understand music? Do we understand music in time domain? When you listen to these different frequencies, different moods are being created in our minds. So we really understand music in frequency domain, in frequency world, so to say. We don't understand and comprehend music in time domain. Do we understand music like this? That hey, that's a 3 volts of sine wave, or oh, that's a 0.5 volt of cos wave, and such a beautiful music. No. We understand music as frequencies, and because of these beautiful frequencies, using a combination of these frequencies, we can create different moods. And that's why it's very important to transform time domain signals into frequency domain. This is for our own convenience, so that we can understand them better there, and then we'll be able to process them better. We can build filters around them, and so on and so forth. So it's very important that our students should know that we transform our signals for our own convenience. Now, we did mention at the beginning that DSP is highly conceptual subject, and the analytical understanding of the underlying concepts is of extreme importance. And I would like to bring this concept out by virtue of giving one very critical example. In fact, couple of very important and interesting examples from DSP. The first example is that of sampling. And sampling theorem is very close and very dear to our hearts. And we have been throwing upon sampling theorem for so many years together. And in wavelet, we typically have multi-rate system. wherein the sampling rate is different at different locations in the system, and that's why it is called as multi-rate system. And that's why let's quickly revisit the concept of sampling theorem and how we can bring out the analytical part, and how we can also understand the implementation part, and probably using a MATLAB code we can make our students understand the sampling theorem much better. Let's quickly do that. So in the slide you can see a simple good looking signal which typically follows all the Dirichlet's conditions. That means it has finite number of maxima and minima, finite number of discontinuities, and so on and so forth. And now, since this is DSP, we are in discrete and digital world, we convert continuous signals into discrete signals by sampling them, and then quantize these discrete signals to then finally convert them into a digital signal. We all know this. But then the question is, how many samples and what should be the sampling rate? And typically, if you see in the slide, there are few samples shown. Are these samples enough? If not, what is the bare minimum number of samples using which the faithful reconstruction is possible? These are the few questions with which the sampling theorem starts. And the analytical part of sampling theorem is extremely important. That needs to be brought out. Many times students, they only end up memorizing the sampling theorem, that sampling frequency should be more than twice the maximum frequency present in the signal. But unless students, they really understand the analytical part of the sampling theorem, they may not be able to completely understand and comprehend the philosophy behind sampling theorem. Let's say the signal typically looks like how it is depicted in slide. Let's say A1 cos 2 pi f1t plus phi1, where A1 is the magnitude, f1 is frequency, and phi1 is the phase associated with the signal. And if the signal is sampled at t is equal to n times ts, where ts is the sampling time, then the continuous time t gets converted into discrete time ts, and the same is depicted in the second equation shown on the slide. Now the question is, using these samples, will I be able to reconstruct back the original signal? If I try and reconstruct my original signal using the samples, then there could be a little too large a class of signals that I may reconstruct, I may end up producing. And then how do we select the original signal out of this? And is it really possible to reconstruct the original signal using the number of samples? These are the questions that the sampling theorem should be able to answer. And what is the analytical understanding? Let's try and figure that out. So one example is shown over here. The original signal and few samples are shown, and then using these samples, they are not enough, and that's why the reconstructed signal, which is a dotted line, is not original signal. And in fact, you can imagine finitely infinite number of combinations of signals passing through these 4 points which are our samples, and that's why we end up getting little too large a class of signals out of these samples, and that's why the sampling frequency has to be selected carefully. But what is the analytical understanding behind this? Let's try and understand that. Why do we end up producing so many signals? Why there is ambiguity? And why there is non-uniqueness? Well, the mathematical understanding is very simple. For example, if we look at the same signal again as a cosine signal, then we know that cos of theta is equal to cos of minus theta, or cos of beta is equal to cos of minus beta. We also know that cos signal is periodic with a period of 2 pi. That's why cos of beta is equal to cos of beta plus 2 pi k, for example. So these are the two main non-unique points, and if we incorporate that in our equation, then a1 cos 2 pi f1 n ts plus phi1, it becomes a1 cos 2 pi nk plus minus 2 pi f1 nts plus minus phi 1. This plus minus emerges out of the fact that cos of beta is equal to cos of minus beta, and there is a periodicity with the period of 2 pi, and that's why that 2 pi nk term pops up. And now if you take 2 pi n times ts common, then what you have inside your bracket is k upon ts plus minus f1 plus phi 1. But this bracket term k upon ts plus minus f1 is extremely important. And we should also remember that if I can do this analysis, these are all linear shift invariant systems. So every frequency is independent. So this is true for f2, this is true for f3 and f4, and going all the way till f of m, which is the maximum frequency present in my signal. And now if we do the plotting of this on my frequency axis, what do I have is x-axis being my frequency axis, and then 0 frequency is shown, and f1, which is my first frequency, is also shown. 1 upon ts, so let's plug in k is equal to 1. So k upon ts becomes 1 upon ts. And then I have 1 upon ts plus minus f1. So let's plot 1 upon ts, and let's also plot 1 upon ts plus f1 and 1 upon ts minus f1. Now similarly, you can think of doing this for f2 and f3 and going all the way till f of m. For f of m, it looks like this. So the maximum frequency is shown, and correspondingly for 1 upon ts minus f1, fm, and 1 upon ts plus fm, these 2 points are also shown. And now you can clearly see, if we go on increasing k, we will have 2 upon ts and 3 upon ts, and it continues. However, this very first point, 1 upon ts, is extremely important for us. And for this 1 upon ts, the 2 other points that we get, 1 upon ts plus fm and minus fm, these 2 points are what are known to us as aliases. And you can clearly see the alias which is closest to maximum frequency fm is 1 upon ts minus fm. So we need to make sure that the closest alias does not enter in our frequency band. Our frequency band ranges from 0 to fm, and so the closest alias, it should not enter in our frequency band. And the only way we can achieve this is by making sure that 1 upon ts minus fm is towards the right hand side of fm. That means it is greater than fm. So if we write it down mathematically, it looks like 1 upon ts minus fm should be greater than fm. I bring fm to this side, and that tells me that my 1 upon ts, which is my sampling frequency, 1 upon ts is my fs, should be greater than twice of fm, that is twice the maximum frequency present in my signal. So this is the analytical understanding of sampling theorem. It is equally important to run our students through the demonstrations. And let's see the sampling demonstration in MATLAB quickly. So this is a demonstration for sampling theorem in MATLAB, and there are different parts of MATLAB. So this is our file directory, this is our command prompt, this is our workplace wherein we have all our variables, and this is the main editor wherein we write our .m files and programs. So in this particular program, this particular code presents the sampling frequency to be 50 Hertz, and then it creates a continuous function using cos 2 pi ft, and then this continuous function is plotted as subplot 131, and then once we create the line space, and once this if any particular function is not any particular syntax is not known, then students can use doc command, which is documentation, like doc line space. If I don't know how line space really works, then MATLAB has a very comprehensive help and search, and students should be able to make good use of this. So the syntax and description and the examples, everything is given. So it's a very self-contained kind of help documentation from MATLAB. Okay. So the continuous function is created and it is plotted as subplot 131, and the maximum frequency in this particular continuous function is 50. Now fs is my sampling frequency, and let's say we have kept it 120, which is more than maximum frequency. Maximum frequency is 50, so twice of that is 100, and sampling frequency is more than 100, 120. And now the sample signal is also created and it is plotted as 132. And once the samples are obtained, then using these samples, then the reconstruction of the original signal is carried out, and the reconstructed signal is also plotted as subplot 133. So towards the end, the instructions are also given as original signal is plotted in blue, and so on and so forth. So these are the comments written at the end. So let's run this program. And you can see this is my original signal of 50 Hertz. These are the samples which have been created. And since the sampling is more than twice the maximum frequency, the reconstructed signal is also correct. Now let's change the sampling frequency. Instead of 120, let's keep it less than twice the maximum frequency. So let's keep it less than 100. Let's keep it 80. And now if we run this program again, this is again my original signal. Now the samples are not enough, and as a result of that, if you see the reconstructed signal, it does not give me the original signal back, and this is because the sampling theorem is not obeyed. If we keep the sampling frequency exactly twice of maximum frequency, then this is called as critical sampling. And you can see this is original signal, B is the critical samples, and so the reconstructed signal is just enough. So these samples are just enough to give me the original signal back, and that's why this is called as critical sampling. So all such demonstrations can be given to students. They can be made to do different experimentation on their own and then come up with their own conclusions. So such kind of field of implementation is extremely vital in DSP, in my opinion. In DSP, we predominantly work with LSI or LTI signals, linear shift invariant or linear time invariant systems. And that's why there are two approaches of analyzing such systems, either using convolution or using difference equations. Let's invoke the convolution operation and let's see how we can use convolution for unleashing the journey towards understanding transforms. The basic concept of convolution is very simple. We can decompose given signal into shifted impulse sequences. We can scale them up with the appropriate magnitude and then add everything up together. We can afford to do this because it's a linear system and it's shift invariant. So the impulses can get shifted and eventually we can scale it up and add everything. So additivity and homogeneity, both these properties, they do apply. and in general systems they follow superposition theorem. One example is shown over here where xn is 0, 1, 0 and -1. So it gets scaled up and delta of n gets shifted, and eventually we can add everything up together to reconstruct that original signal. So this is the concept of convolution. Mathematically, convolution can be encapsulated using this formula. Xn is summation over all k values from -infinity to +infinity x of k times delta n minus k. So because of the linearity and time invariance, all these three steps in convolution, they become valid. So because of this convolution, we typically say if we know the impulse response of the system, we know the system completely. And this is because then we can just keep on shifting these impulses, scale them up, and then we can figure out the responses. So if we know the impulse response, we know that system completely. We can say that, we can claim that we have characterized that system completely. Now the question that Dr. Fourier probably had in his mind was, what could be the input to such linear shift invariant system so that that input acts like a kernel to that system, a basis function to that system, or in other words, an eigenvector to that system. In this pursuit, Dr. Fourier tried exciting and stimulating the systems using many inputs, and he figured out that one interesting input does the job for us. And what was that input? That input was complex exponential of some known independent variable. It could be frequency like omega 0 shown in the figure. This complex exponential is very unique. It's very special. And why is it unique? Let's try and understand that. When the system is excited with this complex exponential of known frequency omega 0, what does it produce? Let's call that output as y of n. And now let's plug in using the convolution formula, and let's try and find out y of n. So you can plug in these values into the system. This is the convolution formula, and after doing the mathematical jugglery, we can actually plug in the values, the complex exponential and h of n, which is our impulse response of the system, and y of n starts looking like this. And now you can clearly see that summation is over all the values of k. So e to the power j omega 0 n can be brought outside. And if you do so, this is what we get towards the end of it. And wow, this is fantastic. What goes into the system is a complex exponential of a known frequency omega 0. What comes out of the system is again the same complex exponential of exactly same frequency omega 0. In other words, this function acts as an eigenfunction of our system. This complex exponential acts as an eigenfunction of our system, and this eigenfunction produces an eigenvalue, and this instantaneous eigenvalue, and then you have summation over all the k values. This together is what is known to us as discrete Fourier transform, DFT. So this is an eigenvalue eigenvector system, and the eigenfunction is responsible for producing all the instantaneous eigenvalues, and when they are summed up, it essentially gives us discrete Fourier transform. This is one way of looking at discrete Fourier transform. But now the question is, what is so special about this constant E? Anyone remembers the value of this constant E? Well, it is irrational constant, so it runs forever, but the truncated value of this constant E is 2.7183. So not a very handsome constant, a little crooked looking constant. And instead of this, my name is Aditya Abhyankar. So let's say AA is equal to 3. I give you a very simple constant, and instead of using e raised to j omega 0 n, let's use my constant a raised to j omega 0 n, and let's see whether it works or not. Well, unfortunately, it will not work, and in fact, no other constant will work. So there has to be something very special, very unique about this particular constant. So let's try and understand that. And to make this whole journey little interesting and exciting, I always share with my students my story of 3 idiots. So let's go through that story. Well, not this particular story, because probably you have already seen this story. But again, in my story, there are 3 idiots. And by idiots, what we really mean is 3 genius scientists. And these 3 genius scientists, in a way, are responsible for giving us the complete framework of transforms that we make use of. However, this story happened in 16th century. So we'll have to traverse little backwards in time. And that's why this is a black and white story. And the first idiot in the story is not R. Madhavan, but Dr. Bernoulli. And there is a story about how Dr. Bernoulli was able to help his banker friend. And there is no authentic source confirming the story. However, the story is very interesting. The story goes like this. Dr. Bernoulli had a banker friend, and unfortunately for him and fortunately for us, his business was not picking up. So he went to Dr. Bernoulli and said, "People say that you are a genius mathematician, so help me. Give me a solution by virtue of which my business will pick up." And Dr. Bernoulli said, "It's simple. Start giving your customers compound interest instead of simple interest." And the banker said, "I am already doing it, but there are so many competitors and so many other bankers that people somehow, they are not interested in investing in my bank." Then Dr. Bernoulli came up with a crazy idea. And he said, "You announce that your customers can draw compound interest in finite number of times on their principal amount." And the banker said, "What kind of a friend you are? I am here for help, and you are telling me something by virtue of which it will destroy my business." And Dr. Bernoulli said, "Just don't worry. Have faith in my mathematical abilities, and you will see the results." And the banker did it. And suddenly people started investing in his bank. And there is a hitch in what Dr. Bernoulli said. We all know that formula for compound interest is, if you are investing 1 rupee or 1 euro or $1 as the principal amount, then the formula is 1 plus 1 upon n bracket raised to n. And all that Dr. Bernoulli said was, let's apply limit so that n tends to infinity. Now, if you're a mathematician, you can solve this using Taylor series or Maclaurin series. However, we being engineers, very quickly, we will see a small demonstration in MATLAB. We'll implement this quickly in MATLAB and see what does this lead us to. So again, this is a MATLAB program, and we have variable n. And this n runs from 1 to very large number. We cannot go all the way till infinity. And then the formula is 1 plus 1 upon n bracket raised to n. And if we run this, then you will realize that it starts with a value of 2, 2.7, 2.7181, and eventually it saturates at 2.7183. I will interrupt this in between because it gets saturated and it will not change its value now. And you will realize that this 2.7183 is indeed the exponential constant that is known to us as. So if we type e to the power 1, it is nothing else but 2.7183, and that's why this is indeed a constant. So accidentally, Dr. Bernoulli was able to invent this constant for us. So what? This constant remained unutilized for almost 50 years after Dr. Bernoulli invented it. And there comes the second genius scientist, my favorite in this trio, Dr. Euler. If you see the life and work of Dr. Euler, my goodness, he excels in both quality as well as quantity. He has done such huge amount of work, and every single piece that he has created is a work of a genius. And my favorite out of these three scientists, Dr. Euler. So what Dr. Euler told us is something very special. He gave us Euler's identity. E raised to I pi is equal to -1. So this was the original form in which Euler's identity was given to us. E is a constant, pi is another irrational constant, and I is imaginary constant, square root of -1. It doesn't even exist. And even today, there is no formal proof of this identity. A case of elevated mind, Dr. Euler was able to sense it, he grasped it and gave it back to the world, and that's it. That's the only way we can understand this invention. And later on, we started making use of a derived form of this Euler's identity, that is e to the power I theta is equal to cos theta plus I sin theta. And it's because of this invention by Dr. Euler, this constant E got a very special meaning. What does this indicate? It essentially tells us that if you imagine an exponential curve and you select any point on this exponential curve and then draw a tangent to this curve, you will realize that the slope of the tangent always matches with its y-intercept. So if you write equation of that tangent, y is equal to mx plus c, m always matches with c. And this, in other words, it tells us that every point on this exponential curve can be resolved equally along x and y axis provided they are orthogonal to each other, or along cos axis and sine axis, because they are anyways orthogonal. The phase difference between the two, between cos and sine, is 90 degrees. In other words, Dr. Euler gave us the very fundamental concept of orthogonality. And it's because of the underlying orthogonality, the transform representation is unique. And because the transform representation is unique, the inverse of the transform definitely exists. And that's why contribution by Dr. Euler is stunning. It is extraordinary. And now comes the third genius and the most famous out of the three, and that is Dr. Fourier. And Dr. Fourier was consistently thinking about, he was thinking continuously about sine waves and cos waves. And he told us that if you have periodic signal, I have my Fourier series solution for you. If you have aperiodic signal, I have Fourier transform solution for it. And it is the culmination of thought process by these three genius scientists that today we have the complete legacy of the transforms. Do you remember what was the first transform you got formally exposed to? Remember 10th standard, when calculators are not allowed and you have to carry log tables with you and do those tedious calculations? The first transform we get formally exposed to is logarithmic transform. And then we end up learning so many transforms, like Laplace transform, where the kernel is e to the power minus st, or Fourier transform, where kernel is e to the power minus j omega n, or Z transform, where the kernel is z to the power minus n, but z is equal to e to the power j omega. Very special case of Fourier transform. And so even in logarithmic transform, the kernel is complex exponential. So in all the conventional transforms, the kernel function, the basis function is the same, and that is complex exponential. And this is the very reason, the meaning that's given to this complex exponential, why Dr. Euler is very special, very unique. The derivative of an exponential is an exponential. An integral of the exponential is again an exponential. And this is a very unique property. This is precisely what makes complex exponential a very natural choice for most of the conventional transforms as their kernel function or the basis function. This all begins with the constant E. E gives us the eigenvalue and eigenvector combination. It becomes the eigenfunction, and it eventually leads us to the Fourier transform. This can be implemented using convolution, because what we are dealing with is LTI systems, linear time invariant systems, and the systems wherein we are working with band limited signals. Why? Because if the frequency band is not finite, how can we sample them? If the maximum frequency is not finite, can we sample it at more than twice the maximum frequency? Not possible. And that's why we typically work with band limited signals. These are aperiodic signals. They follow sampling theorem, no aliasing in reconstruction, that leads us to sparse representation that guarantees orthogonality and the existence of the inverse transform. Once again, the inverse transform can be implemented using convolution, which essentially means all the phase changes are marked as the directional changes. This is the philosophy of eigenvector that leads us to eigenfunction that gives us the eigenvalue, and we come back to this constant E. So this is in nutshell how we can summarize all the transforms that we use conventionally, traditionally. However, do you see something very, very strange in this slide? Probably yes. Band limited signals, they are limited on frequency axis. And we know because of the uncertainty principle that this limitedness cannot be achieved both in time domain as well as frequency domain. So the moment we say that my signal is band limited, I am isolating and restricting my representation in frequency domain. I have to give up that restriction in time domain. In other words, for band limited signals, the time domain kernels should exist from -infinity to +infinity. And these kernels are called as waves because they last forever from -infinity to +infinity. And at some point in time, this is unrealistic. So we let the wave die out. And by letting that happen, we convert waves into wavelet. And we are going to see that very soon, how that actually happens. But right now, I hope this summary of all the conventional transforms is well understood. Now, let's pose a very fundamental, very simple question. How Fourier transform works? And many times, students, they struggle to imagine this, understand this. How exactly the Fourier transform works? If there is a signal with 25 Hz frequency present, and if I take the Fourier transform of that signal, I end up generating a peak at 25 Hz. So how exactly that happens? How the Fourier transform is capable of producing that peak at that specific frequency? Let's try and understand that. So in the diagram, a stationary signal is depicted. It's stationary because all the frequencies are present all throughout. And in fact, there are two frequencies which are present. It's a combination of 0.6 sine 2 pi 3n plus 0.8 cos 2 pi 8n. So this is a linear axis, and that's why we can say that it's a combination of sine 3n and cos 8n. And now just assume that after 8 it becomes cyclic, and that's why the maximum frequencies present are from 1n to 8n, and we can now excite this signal using all the possible kernels. What are the possible kernels? Cos of 1n to cos of 8n, and sine of 1n to sine of 8n. And let's say this signal is excited with cos of 8n, and you can clearly see that cos of 8n exists in the original signal. So the blue function is the original signal and red is our kernel. And because the kernel frequency exists in the signal that we are trying to analyze and process, you can see tremendous amount of correlation between the two. And if you take the dot product or the element by element product between these two, then they end up producing lot of positive area under the curve for this dot product. And when you sum everything up together, it ends up with a peak for that specific frequency. Let's quickly go through one quick MATLAB demo to showcase this. So let's go through this MATLAB program which depicts the working of Fourier transform. Y is the signal, which is made up of two frequencies, 0.5 sine 4x and 0.5 cos 7x. So these are just linear frequencies. That's why I'm saying sine of 4x and cos of 7x. And then we have created a line and we have created a plot of this original signal. YR is the basis function, and let's say to begin with we want to experiment with sine of 1x. Now sine of 1x definitely does not exist in the original signal. So if we excite the original signal with the basis function as sine of 1x, then what happens? We will understand that. Now this sine of 1x, the basis function is also plotted and it's a dotted green line. And then we take the dot product between the two, between y and yr. Y is the signal that we are trying to analyze, yr is the basis function. We take the dot product and then we also plot that dot product as the total area. And let's see how it looks. This is the original signal in red. The dotted green line is sine of 1x, the first basis function, and the dot product is the blue area under the curve. And you can see, since the basis function never existed in the original signal, the blue area is positive and negative, so it will cancel each other out and it will not produce any peak at 1x frequency because of the sine component. Now let's excite it with sine of 4x, and again you will see, so red is the original signal, dotted green line is 4x, and because 4x is present, you can see very good amount of correlation, and the dot product is also excellent, maximum positive part, hardly any negative portion, and that's why nothing gets cancelled or very little thing gets cancelled, and it produces a peak at 4x because of the sine component. If we excite that with sine of 7x, now sine 7x does not exist in the original signal. In the original signal what we have is cos of 7x. Sine of 7x doesn't exist. So you can see poor correlation between red and dotted green line, and as a result of that you get equal amount of positive and negative part in the dot product. They will cancel out each other. Now instead of sine, if we use cos of 7x, then you will realize that cos of 7x definitely is present in the original signal. So we hope to now get good dot product. So this is the original signal in red, and the dotted green line is cos 7x. Oh, excellent correlation. And now if we take the dot product between the two, you will realize that there is maximum positive part. So it ends up generating that peak at 7x because of the cos kernel or the cos basis function. And towards the end of the program, we can also see the comments that can be given as instructions to our students. So we have seen how Fourier transform works. We have also seen that for last so many years we have been using all the conventional transforms. Then why do we need wavelet transform? Why do we really need to move towards the joint time frequency perspective? And let's try and understand that now, because that's extremely important milestone in this journey. And in some way we are again getting back to the same concept of stationary signals and non-stationary signals. And let's understand that with a very simple example that is typically given in most of the textbooks and reference books, but it's very handy. So let's imagine, as you can see in the slide, there are three signals: x1 of t, x2 of t, and x3 of t. x1 has frequency of 5 Hz, x2 has frequency of 25 Hz, and x3 has frequency of 50 Hz. Now, if you take the Fourier transform of all these three signals independently, this is what you will get. You will get x1 of omega, x2 of omega, and x3 of omega. These are the Fourier transforms, and as expected, you will see three peaks corresponding to three frequencies. Now, if we add these three signals, x1, x2, and x3, then this combination gives us a new signal, and let's call that signal as x4 of t. And this signal is stationary signal because all the three frequencies are present all throughout, and that's why such signals are called as stationary signals. And now if you take the Fourier transform of x4 of t, let's call that as x4 of omega, then you will see that simultaneously now you can see three peaks corresponding to the three frequencies which are present in this signal x4 of t. That is 5 Hz, 25 Hz, and 50 Hz. All fine till this point. But now, if we create a non-stationary signal out of the first three signals, then what happens? And the non-stationary signal can be created by simply concatenating these three signals one after the other. So now all the frequencies are not present all throughout. The first frequency exists for some time, then the second frequency, and then the third frequency. Such signals are called as non-stationary signals. And what happens if we take the Fourier transform of such non-stationary signal? We will see a quick demonstration to understand this. So in this code, TS is the sampling time, and then we create three different time zones for three different frequencies: time 1, time 2, and time 3. And when these are concatenated one after other, it creates a non-stationary construct. So that's what is demonstrated in this particular demo. Now x1, as you can see, is a linear combination of the three independent frequencies. So x1 is a stationary signals because all the three frequencies are present all throughout. As against that, if you look at x2, then the three frequencies are concatenated one after the other, and that's why x2 is out and out a non-stationary signal. So not all the frequencies are present all throughout. And then the Fourier transform of x1 and x2 are taken and these are plotted. So let's run this program and let's see the output. So stationary signal produces the FFT and three peaks at corresponding three frequencies. The non-stationary signal, wherein three frequencies they exist at three different timestamps, it produces exactly same Fourier output. And so Fourier transform is insensitive to stationarity of the signal. It does not understand whether the signal is stationary or non-stationary. On top of that, if you take the inverse Fourier transform, invariably it produces a signal which is a stationary signal. So the inverse Fourier transform cannot create a non-stationary signal. This is a serious limitation of Fourier transform. The question is, so what if the Fourier transform is insensitive to non-stationary signals? Well, the fun part is all the real signals that we deal with are de facto non-stationary signals, and Fourier transform is not adequate to handle non-stationary signals. In other words, Fourier transform cannot handle most of the real life signals that we need to process. And that's why I call this journey as journey from romanticism to realism. No doubt Fourier and Z and Laplace and their realms, their characterization, the maths behind, it is so fascinating. One cannot help but get in love with all these transforms. And that's why this is a journey towards realism. And the modern transforms, which are from the realms of joint time frequency perspective, they are very realistic. In other words, they are capable of handling non-stationary signals. In other words, we can say that with the conventional transforms, the underlying assumptions are quite unrealistic. For example, the signals are expected to last from -infinity to +infinity, that is forever. And even the analyzer, even the person who analyzes these signals has finite lifespan. We all start our journey somewhere on timeline and end our journey somewhere on timeline. So it's very unrealistic to assume that the basis functions would last forever. It's very unrealistic. And these basis functions, which last from -infinity to +infinity, are called as waves. And by letting these waves die out, we convert waves into wavelet. We will talk more about wavelets in the second session. We will conclude our first session over here. In the first session, we looked at the conventional transforms and the need to go beyond the realms of these traditional conventional transforms and look at few modern joint time frequency perspective transforms. And this is a journey from romanticism to realism. During these tough COVID-19 pandemic times, academia has seen a paradigm shift and many things have gone on digital platform, and that's why it's very important that faculty members, they should be able to produce very professional, very neat digital lectures on their own without any external help. I hope you enjoyed this particular session which was presented to you digitally. Let's keep sharing ideas with each other and let's keep creating standard quality professional e-content for the betterment of our students. Thank you so very much for your time. Have a good day.